Think about it. Now that we're sort of on the edge of really going beyond Earth, those old questions about, our place, they feel much more immediate, don't they?
Absolutely. Where did we come from? What's our purpose?
Yeah, that basic human drive to know the ultimate truth. It definitely gets sharper when you think about becoming, well, space travelers.
It really does.
And today we're diving into this through Rabbi Dr. Zev Zahavy's book, Whence and Wherefore. It came out in 2021.
Right. The subtitle is key too. The Cosmological Destiny of Man, Scientifically and Philosophically Considered.
Exactly. And we're focusing particularly on his look at Sir Bernard Lovell's essay, In the Centre of Immensities.
Which, that essay came from Lovell's big address back in '75. He was president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science then.
And Zahavy connects it back even further, doesn't he, to Thomas Carlyle.
Yeah, to Carlyle's Sartor Resartus from way back in the 1830s.
Carlyle was wrestling with, well, similar big questions, identity, our role in the universe, stuff like that.
It's pretty significant, that a top scientist like Lovell would engage with those philosophical ideas so directly.
The New York Times picked up on it back then, too, an article titled Whence. And the subtitle nailed it. We are what we know about where we came from.
Which is the core of Whence, right? Origins.
Yeah. And Zahavy pushes beyond that to wherefore, purpose.
Exactly. So that's our mission in this deep dive. Unpack these huge questions of origin and purpose, looking at how Zahavy analyzes Lovell's views.
Using both science and philosophy.
Right. And keeping in mind, this is one specific perspective on these enormous topics.
Okay, let's get into it. Zahavy calls Lovell's question of whence courageous, why?
Well, he frames Lovell's address as potentially a real turning point.
How so?
Like, here's a major scientist suggesting maybe science should think about more than just the lab work. Maybe it should tackle these origin questions.
But there was resistance to that idea.
Oh, definitely. Within the scientific community at the time, the focus was heavily on materialism. Tangible stuff. What you can measure.
And whence pushes you beyond that.
It does. It nudges you toward more abstract thinking. Idealism, philosophy.
Which brings us back to Carlyle again. So Zahavy sees a link, right, between Carlyle criticizing the materialism of his day.
And worries Zahavy raises about our own time. About a purely secular society maybe losing its moral compass. Potentially becoming, well, self-destructive even.
Zahavy points out Carlyle thought connecting with God was, more important than just being happy.
Yeah, and he was critical of science getting too stuck in its ways. Enamored with custom, Carlyle called it.
Okay, and this is fascinating. Lovell actually quoted Carlyle this specific line. Stands he not thereby in the center of immensities, in the conflicts of eternities?
Powerful stuff.
And Zahavy argues this wasn't just, a fancy quote. He thinks it was meant to challenge that materialistic outlook in science, maybe even adjust it.
It really forces you to consider humanity's place on this huge cosmic stage, doesn't it? Beyond just mechanics.
So this leads right into that big philosophical clash. Idealism versus materialism. Zahavy sets these up as the two main systems. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So idealism basically says mind or spirit is the fundamental reality.
Okay.
Our experience, existence itself, it's rooted in something non-physical.
Abstract.
And materialism. It's the opposite. Matter is primary. Everything, including consciousness, thoughts. It all comes down to physical stuff and processes.
But idealism isn't just one single idea, is it? Zahavy mentions different types.
Right. There are various flavors. You've got subjective idealism, all about individual perception. Objective idealism posits a sort of universal mind. Then there's theistic idealism, which brings God into it as the ultimate reality. Zahavy also mentions pantheism, God is everything, Platonism, panpsychism.
Panpsychism.
The idea that mind is like a fundamental property of all matter, plus personalism, absolutism, lots of variations. But he contrasts all that with what he essentially calls atheistic materialism.
And Plato's doctrine of ideas is sort of central to idealism.
Yeah, Zahavy highlights it. Plato's core idea is that these forms or ideas, like the perfect idea of chair or justice, are actually more real than any physical chair or act of justice we encounter.
Because they're eternal.
Exactly. Eternal, unchanging, non-physical. Later thinkers saw them as God's blueprints for creation. Zahavy uses it to show this long tradition of prioritizing the non-physical, which is, very different from science's usual focus.
And Britain had its own key idealist thinkers.
Oh yeah, George Berkeley, for instance, his immaterialism. He argued we only know our own ideas directly. How can we even be sure there is a material world outside our minds?
So for him, reality is ideas.
Pretty much. And those ideas ultimately come from a universal spirit, which he called God. Zahavy also notes how English thought influenced German idealists like Kant and Hegel, and later British idealists tried to blend spirituality with philosophy, pushing back against pure empiricism.
Okay, let's flip to materialism. What are its main tenets?
As Zahavy lays it out, the physical world, material elements, that's all there is. Mind, spirit, they arise from matter, depend on it.
So consciousness isn't primary.
Not in a pure materialistic view, no. It's often seen as secondary. Zahavy traces it back to the ancient Greeks Democritus, Epicurus, then Lucretius, Hobbes, Gassendi, who actually tried to blend Epicurus with Christianity, interestingly.
And Darwinism gave materialism a huge boost, didn't it, in the 19th, 20th centuries?
A massive boost. Natural selection offered this impersonal mechanism for evolution. No need for a guiding hand or transcendent purpose from that viewpoint. Darwin's focus on humans as biological organisms fit right in. It became really influential and still is in science and culture.
So with that philosophical background set, we get to this discussion of science versus theology, and that classic split between how and why.
Yeah, and Zahavy clarifies this well. Science, with its methods, is brilliant at the how, the mechanics, the processes.
How things work.
Exactly. But theology, philosophy, they tend to focus more on the why, the ultimate reasons, the purpose behind it all.
And Lovell himself admitted science has limits here, right? When it comes to those big metaphysical why questions. Like, why is there a universe? What's the point of life?
Precisely. The scientific method isn't really built for those questions. But, Zahavy adds, metaphysics shouldn't ignore science either.
It can use scientific findings.
Yeah, it can incorporate what science discovers when trying to frame those why answers. It could be complementary.
Zahavy also points out that the word why can be tricky. There's the big cosmic why anything instead of nothing.
And then there's the more personal why me, like why am I suffering, which is more of a complaint.
Right, different things. And he tackles that atheist challenge. Okay, if God started it, why was there God instead of nothing?
He compares it to a child asking, who made God?
Which kind of misses the point, doesn't it? If God is defined as uncaused, eternal, outside time and space.
Exactly. It pushes against the limits of our finite understanding. The concept itself often implies something beyond that kind of questioning.
And Zahavy sees this tension, right, between the scientific view, often influenced by Darwinism, of a universe without inherent purpose,
and our deep-seated human need to find meaning. He asks, if there's no purpose, why this apparent progression in nature from simple to complex life? It's a provocative question.
Okay, let's shift to science at an impasse. Cosmological origins. This is where science really hits a wall, looking back at the beginning.
It is. Even with our best telescopes, we can only see so far back. There's a last frontier of contact, as Zahavy puts it.
The Big Bang is the main model, right? Universe starting super dense and hot, expanding.
Yeah, maybe 20 to 60 billion years ago, though dates vary. Galaxies forming later, maybe 9 billion years ago, still expanding now. That's the standard picture.
But the impasse is, science can describe what happened after that initial moment.
But not the moment itself, not the nature of that primeval atom, where it came from, what caused it. Lovell's Great Fog Barrier analogy captures it perfectly. We just can't scientifically see beyond that point.
And Zahavy contrasts the Big Bang with the old steady-state theory.
Right. Steady-state proposed matter was continuously created as the universe expanded, keeping the density constant, trying to avoid a beginning.
But it had problems.
Logical ones, yeah. Where does this new matter constantly come from? And what's the source of the physical laws governing it all? Who's the intellectual sponsor, as Zahavy phrases it? It raised its own tricky questions.
It's interesting. He includes that story from the Cornell biochemistry class.
Oh, the dRNA programming one.
Yeah, where the professor, asked about the origin of the program, jokingly mentions a generator of diversity and hints at his initials.
It's a small anecdote, but it highlights how even subtly theological ideas can sort of creep back in when scientists confront these ultimate origin questions, even if just metaphorically.
Which brings us to the paradox of modern science. More unanswerable questions.
Well, seemingly unanswerable for now, like the whole open versus closed universe debate. Will it expand forever or collapse back?
Zahavy mentions astronomer Alan Sandage changed his mind on that.
Yeah, showing how uncertain it still is. And the implications are huge, philosophically speaking, either way.
And then black holes.
Another massive paradox. Infinite mass, infinite gravity, packed into zero space, space-time breaking down. Our current physics just doesn't fully compute there.
Zahavy also really focuses on the fine-tuning aspect.
He does, the constants of nature, like the charge on a proton and an electron being almost perfectly equal but opposite.
If they were even slightly different.
The universe as we know it, with stars, chemistry, life, it just wouldn't exist. Lovell stressed how incredibly precise this balance had to be right in the first tiny fraction of a second.
It really makes you wonder. Chance? Or something else?
That's the profound question it raises, isn't it?
So, having explored whence and its limits, Zahavy then asks, essentially, is whence enough? And points to the need for wherefore.
Exactly. He argues just asking where did we come from is incomplete. It stops short of the deeper questions about purpose, about meaning.
And he suggests Lovell's focus on whence might even be implicitly pointing beyond science, towards God.
That seems to be Zahavy's reading, yeah. The question itself pushes you towards a realm science can't directly analyze.
He also voices concern about society adopting science's necessary amorality as a general life philosophy.
Right. Science has to be amoral in its method, describing what is. But if we adopt that as our entire worldview, Zahavy worries it could lead to moral decay.
So we need to go beyond how to wherefore, for ethics, for meaning.
That's his argument. We need that deeper understanding of purpose to ground our values.
This sets up his framework of the 8 levels of human existence. Can you walk us through that? It sounds intriguing.
It's quite a detailed model. He splits it into 2 main stages, the biological plane and the intellectual plateau. 4 levels on each.
The biological plane.
Starts with brute man, then domesticated, civilized, and finally majestic biological man. Each represents increasing social structure and self-mastery, but still primarily focused on the physical world.
And the intellectual plateau.
That's where things shift. You get technological man, then philosophical, theological, and prophetic man at the top. Each step reflects a deeper engagement with understanding and meaning.
So different levels, different ways of seeing the world.
Exactly. Biological man is about what survival needs. Technological man is the how practical applying knowledge could be amoral.
Pragmatic.
Very pragmatic. Then philosophical man starts asking why and wherefore. Conceptualizes God, maybe, but often as a remote he.
And theological man. That sounds more personal.
It is. Theological man seeks the who behind it all, but as a thou. Wants a relationship and intimacy with God, not just an abstract concept.
And the highest level, prophetic man.
Prophetic man, in Zahavy's view, grasps the individual ego, the I, as this cradle of consciousness. And from understanding the self-I, infers the existence of a divine I.
Okay.
And this leads to moral insight grounded in God's will perceived in nature. Like the drive to preserve life yields, thou shalt not kill. It's a very integrated view.
That framework really informs his next point, doesn't it? Accident and chance versus divine design. He sounds skeptical of pure chance explaining everything.
He definitely pushes back against that. He argues, accidents don't usually create complex, repeating, regenerative processes like we see in life and the cosmos.
He distinguishes chance acting on the particular versus the universal.
Right, like which acorn sprouts might be chance. But the existence of the oak tree species, the laws that allow it to grow, he sees that as preordained, not accidental, universal.
So the fundamental patterns, the laws of physics, the nature of species, they seem designed.
That's his implication. And he asks the unavoidable question, who or what imparted that pattern? Who set those laws?
And for him, God is the most rational answer.
It's the answer, he argues, provides the most rational validity. He even links it to science's own quest for ultimate simplicity and symmetry quirks, fundamental forces suggesting that drive itself points towards a unifying principle, like God.
He also briefly touches on things like quasars, multiple universes, suggesting maybe we don't have the full cosmic picture yet anyway.
Right, hinting that our understanding is still evolving, potentially quite limited.
Which leads to the plight of the particular, nature's apparent indifference to the individual.
Yeah, nature seems focused on the species, the continuation. Individual suffering often seems secondary in the grand biological scheme.
And that can fuel existential angst, right? The feeling that individual life is meaningless if nature doesn't care.
Exactly. The atheist existentialist perspective often stems from that apparent indifference.
But Zahavy argues humans are different. Our intellect, our self-awareness,
creates a need for individual meaning. We aren't content just being part of the species propagation machine. We seek purpose beyond biology.
And finding that purpose involves recognizing the self, the immortal,
and its potential link to the I divine, to God. That connection, he argues, is where authentic existence and meaning are found.
So on those higher intellectual levels he described, the individual isn't just expendable.
No, the particular matters. It enters into a relationship with the divine.
And he concludes that our ability to even ask wherefore, to ask about purpose,
Implies a responsibility to seek the who, and that the journey of understanding our own self, the immortal, can actually lead to discovering the I divine, which gives individual life profound significance.
So wrapping this up, this dive into Zahavy looking at Lovell really highlights that tension, doesn't it? Science asking how, and the human spirit needing to know whence, and crucially, wherefore.
It really does. It shows how science, powerful as it is for understanding mechanisms, might just have built-in limits when it comes to those ultimate origin and purpose questions.
And the philosophical, theological perspectives Zahavy brings in, they offer other ways, maybe complementary ways, to explore those deeper meanings and our own place in this immense universe.
It leaves you thinking, doesn't it? This whole exploration of whence and wherefore. Maybe our very capacity for self-awareness, that ache for meaning, maybe that's the biggest clue. A sign of connection to something beyond just the material. What does thinking about all this spark in your own sense of place in these immensities?